What if something inside you goes completely undetected by every test, untouched by every medication, beyond the reach of every diagnosis? And yet it is there, present, heavy, wearing you down from the inside with a persistence you can no longer explain. You are not imagining the pain, and you are not alone in asking this question. Saint Teresa of Jesus asked it before you, with her own body as the battleground, with her own sleepless nights as the laboratory. And what she found at the heart of that question changed forever the way we understand the relationship between the soul and the body it calls home. Because there are illnesses that are born where no one thinks to look, and Saint Teresa of Jesus knew this. She spent years sick, genuinely, documentably sick, with no one able to cure her. Years of real physical pain. And during that long season of suffering, instead of turning away from God because of the pain, she went deeper. Deeper into the soul, deeper into the truth. And what she found there, in those depths that very few people dare to descend into, was something that the Church took a long time to fully take in. She found that the body speaks what the soul keeps silent, that certain wounds, the ones never brought to God, eventually speak through the body in a way the modern world calls illness, and that the contemplative tradition calls something else entirely. If right now there is something in your body that will not let go, something that keeps coming back, something the doctors cannot quite account for, you need to stay with this until the very end. Because what Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote about this was written for you, even though 5 centuries have passed. Before we go any further, I want to ask you to leave in the comments the name of that particular ailment you have been carrying for a long time, the one that refuses to leave. Not to put it on display, to offer it up, so that the prayer Saint Teresa of Jesus taught us can begin its work right now. There is a passage in the book of her life that Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote with an honesty that still catches readers off guard the first time they encounter it. She did not write it to impress anyone. She wrote it because it was true, and because truth, when it is large enough, cannot be kept inside without beginning to cause harm. She wrote it after years of being ill without understanding why, years of physicians arriving with remedies that remedied nothing, years of a body that gave way, that failed her, that refused to respond the way she needed it to in order to do what she felt God was asking of her. And in that passage, Saint Teresa of Jesus does not speak of her illness as a misfortune or as a trial to be endured with stoic resignation. She speaks of it as a language, as something her body was saying out loud because her soul had been saying it in silence for far too long, and no one had been listening. That is the first thing you need to understand tonight. Illness, in the spiritual tradition that Saint Teresa of Jesus left us, is not the enemy. It is the messenger. And to silence the messenger without reading the message is precisely what happens when someone treats the body without ever attending to what the soul is trying to communicate through it. Saint Teresa of Jesus came to the convent as a young woman already carrying wounds she had not yet named. The death of her mother when she was a child, an adolescence in which the world outside drew her with a force she herself describes with a kind of embarrassed honesty decades later in the book of her life. A father she loved deeply and whose relationship with her was complicated, woven through with devotion and guilt in equal measure, in ways that move across those pages with a delicacy that still astonishes. She entered the convent, and the illnesses began almost immediately. Pains without a clear name, weakness that left her bedridden for days at a time, conditions that the doctors of Avila and Besadas tried to treat, with methods that in some cases left her worse than before. There was a period when her condition was so grave that her father believed her dead. There were days when she believed it herself. And yet, in the middle of all of that, something was happening that was invisible from the outside, something only she could perceive from within. because while the body was failing, the soul was beginning to awaken, not in a smooth and orderly way, in a way that frightened, that disoriented, that forced her to release things she had thought were part of herself, only to discover they were obstacles. Saint Teresa of Jesus lived that experience in her own flesh and recorded it with a precision that remains, centuries later, the most honest map that exists for anyone walking that same ground. What she discovered, through time, through prayer, and through that particular way she had of looking inward without flinching, even when what she found there caused her pain, is that her body had been speaking from the very beginning of something her soul had been unable to say any other way. It spoke of the weight of unresolved things, of bonds that had not been healed, of fears that had never been surrendered to God, of old sorrows that had settled into the interior of the soul like uninvited guests. Once no one had asked to stay, but no one had ever asked to leave. In the first dwelling places of the interior castle, Saint Teresa of Jesus describes the human soul with an image that has survived 5 centuries because it is exactly true. She describes it as a castle made of diamond or of very clear crystal, with many rooms within it. And she says that there are souls who spend their entire lives in the outer rooms of that castle without ever daring to go further in, without ever daring to move toward the center where the king waits. They live at the edges. They live on the surface. And that way of living, says Saint Teresa of Jesus, has consequences that are not only spiritual, because the body lives where the soul lives. This is the most radical insight in all of Teresian mysticism as it applies to illness. The body is not a separate container that operates on its own, while the soul goes about its business somewhere else entirely. The body lives at exactly the same level of depth at which the soul that inhabits it lives. If the soul lives on the surface, in restlessness, in noise, in the endless stream of external things that never quite satisfy, the body pays that price. It pays with tension. It pays with inflammation. It pays with that deep exhaustion that does not lift even after sleep, because it is not the body that is exhausted, but the soul that inhabits it. A soul that has spent far too long living at a distance from its own center. How many spiritual routes did Saint Teresa of Jesus identify? How many ways did she find that a wounded soul speaks through the body it inhabits? That answer lies further in. But before we get there, something must be understood, something Saint Teresa of Jesus considered fundamental, and that most people overlook because it is uncomfortable to look at squarely. The soul does not fall ill in just one way. There are ailments of the soul with very precise names, ailments that have always existed, that Saint Teresa of Jesus recognized in herself and in the women she guided spiritually. And each of those ailments has its own particular way of manifesting in the body. Not a fabricated illness, a real one, with real symptoms, with real suffering that deserves every bit of the seriousness and love with which Saint Teresa of Jesus always treated human pain, because she knew it from the inside, because she had lived it in her own body before she could write about it with the clarity that only true experience gives. And there is something more. Something Saint Teresa of Jesus discovered about prayer in relation to illness that none of her contemporaries had articulated with that kind of precision. It is not that prayer heals in the way a medication heals. It is that prayer, when it is directed to the right root, when it reaches the exact place where the soul is wounded, sets in motion something within the castle that the body sooner or later cannot ignore. There is an image that Saint Teresa of Jesus uses in the interior castle that very few people remember because it appears almost in passing, tucked between other images that are larger and more luminous, but which anyone who reads it at precisely the right moment in their life cannot forget. She speaks of a soul that has something inside it, something dark and heavy that it cannot bring itself to release. And she says that this thing is like a stone the soul drags through every corridor of the castle. It does not matter which dwelling place she tries to enter. It does not matter how much she prays. It does not matter how many candles she lights or how many masses she attends. The stone goes with her everywhere. And while the stone is there, says Saint Teresa of Jesus, the castle cannot fill with light because the light cannot reach the corners that are being crushed beneath a weight the soul refuses to set down. That stone has a name, and Saint Teresa of Jesus was not afraid to name it plainly because she understood that naming things is the first step toward being able to surrender them. It is called resentment. It is called the wound that has never been brought to God. It is called the pain of what someone did to you that still lives inside you as if it happened yesterday, even though years have passed, even though that person may be gone, even though you have told yourself 1,000 times that you are over it and that you have let it go. Resentment does not need to be consciously fed in order to stay alive inside the soul. It does not need you to think about it every day or give it deliberate attention. It lives in the body with an independence that astonishes anyone who discovers it. It lives in the tension of shoulders that never quite drop, even when there is no visible reason for them to be tight. It lives in the stomach that knots when you hear a certain name, a certain voice, a certain story that cuts a little too close to your own. It lives in the jaw that stays clenched even at night when the body ought to be resting. It lives in that pressure in the chest that arrives without warning, the one doctors give one name to, and Saint Teresa of Jesus would have given another, because she knew that pressure has a root, and the root is not in the chest. What Saint Teresa of Jesus came to understand about resentment, she did not learn solely from theology or from the books she had read, or from the spiritual direction she received from her confessors. She learned it from her own interior experience, which was always her most honest and most reliable laboratory. Saint Teresa of Jesus carried wounds that took her years to recognize as such. She carried the wound of a mother lost in childhood, an absence she transformed into devotion to Our Lady, with that extraordinary capacity she had for turning pain into prayer before it could harden into bitterness. She carried the wound of a religious life that in the early years did not give her what she had hoped for, drier and more difficult than she had imagined when she first crossed the threshold of the convent. She carried the wound of being misunderstood, of being watched, of having to defend her life of prayer before people who regarded her with a suspicion that at times amounted to open hostility. And in the book of her life, there are passages where that wound surfaces with a raw honesty that moves you deeply. Passages where Saint Teresa of Jesus admits that there were moments when the weight of being misunderstood pressed down harder than she would have liked, moments when it was genuinely difficult not to hold on to some bitterness toward those who made hard things harder. What saved her was not that the pain disappeared. What saved her was what she chose to do with it. Saint Teresa of Jesus developed over the course of her life a practice that has no technical name in her writings, but which runs through every page of them like an underground current sustaining everything else. It was the practice of bringing the wound to prayer without disguising it first, without presenting it clean and tidy and properly dressed so it could enter God's presence without embarrassment, without first converting it into something more acceptable, more spiritual, more presentable, bringing it exactly as it was, with all its weight and all its ugliness and all the anger or grief that might still be in it, and placing it before God with the same direct honesty with which a small child shows a mother a wound that hurts, even though it is a little shameful to have it, and even though there is no good way to explain exactly how it happened. That is precisely what resentment cannot survive. Resentment lives in the darkness of the soul's interior. It lives in the silence of things that are never brought into prayer because they seem too embarrassing or too small or too ugly or too human to bring before God. It lives in that space the soul withholds from prayer because it feels it must first sort out its feelings on its own. And then, once it is better, once it has moved past things, then it can return to God with something more worthy to offer. The moment resentment is named in prayer, the moment the soul draws it out of its hiding place and holds it up under God's gaze without trying to justify it, explain it, or erase it prematurely, something inside the castle begins to shift. Not all at once, not with the drama of a visible miracle that everyone around can verify, but with that slow, sure, unhurried movement of things that are real, the kind that do not reverse once they have begun. And the body notices. The body always notices before the mind has fully processed what is happening, because resentment lodged in the soul is not a neutral presence for the body that soul inhabits each day. It is not a purely interior matter, contained within the invisible space of the spirit without spilling outward. It spills. It spills into sustained inflammation, into muscular tension that will not release, into a nervous system living in a state of activation that was never designed to be permanent. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew this from mystical experience, and contemporary medicine has arrived at the same conclusion through the laboratory. Chronic, unresolved emotional states produce real and measurable physical consequences in the body. Consequences that lie at the root of illnesses with proper names, illnesses treated in the body, that keep coming back because the root was never touched. Is there then a specific prayer for healing this root? Is there a concrete way that Saint Teresa of Jesus taught for bringing resentment to God in a manner that genuinely transforms it rather than simply suppressing it? That answer is coming. But before it arrives, there is something Saint Teresa of Jesus considered even more urgent than resentment, something harder to detect because it disguised itself more convincingly, something that devout souls rarely recognize in themselves because it wears the outward appearance of responsibility, of care, of virtue, and which inwardly is a wound that devours peace just as silently and just as efficiently as resentment, only without anyone, not even the person carrying it, being able to see it clearly. There is a trap that Saint Teresa of Jesus described in the way of perfection with a precision that unsettles, because anyone who reads it slowly recognizes something they have felt for years without ever finding the right words for it. The trap does not look like sin. It does not look like weakness or lack of faith or spiritual negligence. It looks like virtue. It looks like a responsible person who takes their obligations seriously, a mother who cares for everyone without complaint, a son or daughter who does not abandon an ailing parent, a believer who genuinely worries about the people they love and does everything in their power to protect them from harm. It looks like someone who is on top of everything, who cannot rest because they feel they cannot afford to rest, who carries the weight of family and home and illness and debt and an uncertain future with a dedication that others admire from the outside, without knowing what that dedication costs on the inside, or what it is doing to the body sustaining it. That trap has a name that Saint Teresa of Jesus never pronounced with judgment, only with compassion, because she had known it from the inside herself. It is called the fear that is never surrendered to God. She knew it well because she had lived it in her own life for years. Before she found the prayer of quiet, before her interior life discovered that deep center from which nothing external could permanently rob her of peace, Saint Teresa of Jesus was a woman who carried nameless fears for a time she herself describes in the book of her life with a mixture of honesty and tenderness toward the young woman she once was. The fear of not being enough for God, the fear that her past failings had closed doors she could never open again, the fear of illness, which in her case was also a concrete, daily reality and not a product of imagination, the fear of losing the people she loved deeply, the fear of not fulfilling what she sensed was being asked of her, which at times felt far too large for the strength she had. In the book of her life, there is a passage where Saint Teresa of Jesus describes this state in words that anyone who has known chronic anxiety would recognize immediately, even though that term did not exist in her time. She speaks of a soul that is always looking over its shoulder, always braced for what might come, always on guard against a danger that never arrives all at once, but simply stays circling. And she says that this state of permanent vigilance exhausts the soul in a way that no physical rest can repair, because physical rest does not reach as far down as the root of that exhaustion. That is what anxiety becomes when it settles into the soul as a permanent climate, not the legitimate concern that any responsible person feels when facing real problems, which is a natural and proportionate response to situations that genuinely call for attention, but rather that state of alertness with no off switch, that shapeless, sourceless fear that no longer needs a specific object to exist because it has long since stopped waiting for anything in particular and installed itself as a permanent interior condition. The air breathed inside the castle, the constant backdrop against which everything else takes place. And what that state does to the body it inhabits over months and years is something Saint Teresa of Jesus observed with the same clarity with which she observed everything that occurred in the interior of the human soul. She observed that the soul living at that level of sustained alertness cannot pray in depth, not because it does not want to pray, not because it is lazy in its faith or lukewarm in its devotion, but because deep prayer requires the soul to lower its guard, at least for a moment. It requires that fundamental act of trust that consists in saying interiorly, "For this little while, I am not going to hold anything up by my own strength. For this little while, I'm placing everything in God's hands and trusting that the world will not collapse just because I've set down what I have been carrying." And the soul that has spent years convinced that everything will fall apart the moment it lets go, that soul does not know how to make that gesture. It has confused vigilance with faithfulness. It has confused control with love. It has come to believe that carrying everything alone is the same as being a good Christian, without realizing that carrying everything alone is the exact opposite of what faith proposes. What Saint Teresa of Jesus discovered through her own experience is that this fear, the fear that is never surrendered, produces very concrete effects in the body. The body housing a soul in a state of permanent alertness lives under a tension that knows no real rest, a tension that does not always show up clearly in medical tests, but which lies at the root of conditions that do have names and diagnoses, conditions that a doctor treats with partial success, treating the visible symptoms while being unable to reach the invisible cause, conditions that improve during treatment and return as soon as the next difficult situation arrives, reactivating an alert system that never properly switched off because the root was never addressed. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in The Way of Perfection that the soul, which never learns to let God be God in its life, ends up carrying a weight that was never designed for human shoulders, that it crushes the body because it first crushes the soul, and that the answer is not to try harder or to be braver or to find a more efficient way to carry what is being carried. The answer is learning to let go. Learning that letting go is not abandonment, it is trust. Learning that there are hands far greater than yours that have been waiting to hold exactly what you have been trying so long to hold on your own. In which part of your life are you still carrying alone what God has long been offering to carry with you? That question does not need an immediate answer. It needs to go with you, because the root that comes next is the one Saint Teresa of Jesus considered the most silent of all, the most difficult to see precisely because it wears the appearance of something entirely different from what it truly is. In the 7th chapter of The Interior Castle, Saint Teresa of Jesus writes something that, once read slowly, is not easily shaken off. She writes it without drama, in that characteristic way she had of saying the most serious things, as if they were conversations between friends, as if what she is describing were the most natural thing in the world, even as it is at the same time among the most profound. She says that the soul which gives up prayer is like someone who walks out of the castle into open country, that it leaves behind the protection of the walls that sheltered it, that it becomes exposed to everything that could not reach it before because it was inside, and that this exposure is not only spiritual in some abstract sense, it has consequences that are visible, that are felt, that the body registers before the mind has even fully grasped what is happening inside the soul. This is the third kind of spiritual root that Saint Teresa of Jesus identified clearly as a possible source of certain illnesses that persist and recur. The withdrawal from prayer, not a dramatic and conscious abandonment of faith, not a deliberate decision to turn one's back on God with full awareness of what is being done. Something quieter than that, and for that very reason, more dangerous, because it goes for a long time without anyone noticing, beginning with the person living it. The gradual, nearly imperceptible drifting away that begins when life grows complicated, when time grows short, and prayer is the first thing sacrificed because it seems to carry the least immediate and visible consequences. Because work cannot wait, and children cannot wait, and the house cannot wait, and the sick cannot wait, and everything else has an urgency with a face and a name. While prayer always seems as though it can wait a little longer, without anyone filing a complaint, without anything breaking down overnight, without the consequences becoming visible the next day. Saint Teresa of Jesus devoted page after page in the book of her life to describing the years when she herself lived that withdrawal from the inside. And what she describes in those pages has an honesty that stands in sharp contrast to the solemn image people sometimes hold of the saints, as if they had been born perfect, and their path had always run in a straight line without detours or setbacks or periods of darkness. Saint Teresa of Avila did not walk a straight line. She had years of fervent prayer, followed by periods in which prayer slowly emptied from within, even as it continued to exist from without. She kept praying. She kept fulfilling her religious obligations with the outward faithfulness that her state of life required. But prayer had become something she performed without being fully present in what she was doing. Words without an interior. A gesture that retained its form, but had lost the substance that had once made it alive and powerful and capable of transformation. And Saint Teresa of Jesus writes about those years with a precision that is striking. She writes that during that period of prayer without depth, her body and her soul were equally unwell, and that she could not clearly tell where the physical illness ended and the spiritual dryness began. That the two fed each other in a continuum that made it impossible to treat them separately, as if they were two distinct problems with nothing to do with each other. When she tried to pray with any depth, the body protested with pain and a weariness that made it impossible to sustain the posture of prayer for the time it would have required. And when the body surrendered to illness and left her bedridden, the soul fell into a darkness that made it even harder to find the energy and the desire to return to prayer with the seriousness she knew it deserved. A circle that closed in on itself with a merciless efficiency, one that could not be broken from the outside because the way out was not outside. The way out, when it finally came to Saint Teresa of Avila, came from within. And it came from exactly where she least expected it, by the simplest path she could have imagined. It did not come through some new ascetic practice, or an additional devotion added to the ones she already had, or a greater exertion of willpower to force a depth that willpower alone cannot produce. It came through an image, specifically through the image of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. Saint Teresa of Jesus recounts in the book of her life that there was a moment when, contemplating that image with the eyes of the heart more than the eyes of the body, something inside her gave way in a manner that no previous effort of years had managed to achieve. Something that had been tensed for a long time released itself with the unexpected softness of something that falls when the exact moment arrives in which it was always destined to fall. And from that moment, prayer began to have an interior again. It began to have warmth and weight and that particular density that belongs to things which are genuinely alive. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote that whoever abandons prayer is like someone who puts out the only light they have in a dark room, that they can move through the darkness for a time on the memory of what the room looked like when there was light, but that memory grows thin, that the obstacles they once saw clearly, they now strike without having seen them coming, and that a body stumbling in the dark ends up getting hurt in ways that could have been avoided if the light had stayed on. The specific prayer for this route is not a formula to be recited. It is a gesture to be made. It is the gesture of returning, of entering the castle through a door that was left slightly ajar for too long, not fully closed, because deep down, the soul always knew it needed to come back. Saint Teresa of Jesus is very clear on this point. God does not close that door, even if the soul takes years to return. The door remains open from within, waiting for someone to push it, with whatever hand is available, however weak or trembling, however full of doubt about whether it deserves to come back. And the first movement of that hand pushing the door already counts. It is already real prayer. It is already enough for something inside the castle to begin lighting up again, with that light the soul needed and which the body, though it may not yet know it, has also been waiting for. There is a kind of pain that contemporary culture has learned to name with more respect than it once did, but which it still does not quite know how to treat at its deepest root. Not for lack of specialists or books or methods or carefully designed and well-intentioned protocols, but because this pain has a dimension that no purely human method can touch at its ultimate depth, a dimension that opens only through faith. It is the pain of grief, the pain of losing someone who was woven into you so deeply and so daily that when they left, they took with them something you cannot quite name, but whose absence you feel in every hour of the day with a precision that no one who has not lived it can fully understand. And that pain, when it is never lifted to God, when it remains locked inside the soul without finding the channel that would allow it to be transformed into something that does not destroy everything it touches, is one of the most powerful spiritual wounds that Saint Teresa of Jesus identified as a root of illnesses. The body speaks when the soul can take no more. Saint Teresa of Avila knew grief from childhood. She lost her mother as a young girl, at an age when loss is not processed but simply moves in, settling into the interior without words or structures or rituals adequate to contain it. And what Saint Teresa of Jesus did with that early loss is one of the most beautiful and most instructive testimonies of her entire life. She went to a church. She knelt before an image of Our Lady, and she asked her to be her mother, not as a metaphor, not as a pious gesture of the kind one makes because something must be done, and nothing else comes to mind, as a real petition, addressed to a real presence, with the honest urgency of a little girl who has just lost what she needed most and cannot bear to live without somewhere to put the love that now has no one to receive it. That gesture of the child, Saint Teresa of Jesus, once was, contains the whole of the teaching she would transmit decades later about grief. It holds the complete key. The pain is not denied. It is not stored away. It is not converted into a dignified and silent offering carried with composure so that no one is made uncomfortable. The pain is brought to God exactly as it is, brought with all its urgency, brought with all its rawness, brought with that sense of bottomless emptiness that frightens precisely because it seems to have no bottom. Because every time you think you have reached the limit of the pain, you discover there is still more beneath. But Saint Teresa of Jesus observed, through her long experience as a spiritual guide to women passing through losses of every kind, something that troubled her deeply. She observed that there was a particular kind of grief that would not be lifted to God, not because the person lacked the desire, not because they lacked faith, But because there was something in that grief that resisted being surrendered, something the soul held onto with a stubborn tenacity it did not always understand in itself. It was grief that had become an identity. Grief that, over time, had stopped being the response to the pain of a specific loss and had become the way the soul defined itself. The person who was no longer simply someone who lost a mother or a child or a husband. The person who had become their grief, who carried it everywhere, not as a wound in the process of healing, but as a part of themselves they no longer knew how to separate from the rest. Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in The Interior Castle that the soul was made for movement toward God, that its deepest nature is the impulse toward the center of the castle where God awaits it, and that anything which permanently halts that movement, anything the soul embraces so tightly that it can no longer move forward, becomes with time a prison, even if at the beginning it was entirely legitimate. Grief at the outset is always legitimate. It is the natural and necessary response of love in the face of absence. It is the price of love. And Saint Teresa of Jesus never spoke of grief as something to be suppressed or moved past too quickly. But when grief embeds itself in the interior of the soul and stops its movement toward God for months and years, when the soul can no longer pray because the pain fills everything and blocks out everything, when love for the departed becomes a weight that crushes rather than a bond that elevates, then grief has crossed the threshold of what the soul can carry alone without beginning to fall ill. And the body, always the faithful messenger of the soul's condition, begins to speak. It speaks through a profound exhaustion that sleep does not touch. It speaks through inflammation that appears without clear cause. It speaks through pains that migrate from one part of the body to another, as if searching for the exact way to say what the soul has still not been able to say out loud. Saint Teresa of Jesus did not use this vocabulary, but she was describing exactly this when she spoke of souls that had come to a standstill in the outer rooms of the castle, with their arms aching from holding what they could no longer put down. The prayer for this embedded grief is not the prayer of someone asking for the pain to go away. It is the prayer of someone asking for the grace to lift what they carry. It is the difference between asking God to remove the weight and asking God to teach the hands to release it. Saint Teresa of Avila taught her sisters that the departed loved ones we love are not lost in some place beyond love's reach. That love crosses death. That love lifted in prayer arrives, and that in the moment the soul learns to love the departed through prayer rather than through clinging. Something in the interior of the castle moves with a freedom the body too begins to breathe. There is a spiritual root that Saint Teresa of Jesus identified in her writings with a clarity that unsettles, precisely because it affects people who from the outside appear to be perfectly fine. People who go to Mass, who pray the Rosary, who fulfill their religious duties without anyone being able to point to any visible failing. People who, if asked to give an account of their life of faith before any outside observer, could do so without shame. And yet on the inside, something is not flowing. Something has hardened without their knowing exactly when it began to harden. Something that makes prayer feel increasingly dry, that makes Mass feel increasingly routine, that leaves faith still present, but somehow cooler than it once was, at a temperature they remember from some earlier point in their life, but no longer know how to recover. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew that state. She describes it in the book of her life in words that anyone who has lived it recognizes straight away. She names it in different ways, in different passages, but the root she is always pointing to is the same. It is ingratitude. It is the forgetting of graces received. It is that tendency of the human soul to grow accustomed to God's gifts, to the point of ceasing to perceive them as gifts at all, of beginning to perceive them simply as part of the ordinary landscape of life, as things that are just there, that will presumably keep being there, without any need to pause and give thanks for their presence, Saint Teresa of Avila was precise about this, and it is worth following her closely because her insight here goes much deeper than it might first appear. She is not speaking of ingratitude in the ordinary sense, the kind where someone receives a favor from another person and does not say thank you. She is speaking of something more profound, more structural. She is speaking of the soul that has received faith as a gift, that has received the sacraments as a gift, that has received prayer as a gift, that has even received its own sufferings as a gift. Because Saint Teresa of Jesus had that extraordinary capacity to see the spiritual value in things that from the outside appear to be nothing but loss, and which has nevertheless stopped seeing any of those things as gifts, has stopped being amazed, has stopped being moved, has stopped pausing before the extraordinary reality of what it has, in order simply to press on with what comes next. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in the book of her life that the soul which fails to call to mind the graces it has received from God closes itself to the ones still to come. That gratitude is not merely a commendable spiritual attitude, it is a condition for grace to continue flowing into the interior of the castle. It is like keeping open the door through which light enters. And the soul that closes that door, through forgetfulness, through routine, through that gradual numbing that Saint Teresa of Jesus called lukewarmness, does not lose its faith all at once. It loses it by degrees of temperature, by degrees of interior warmth, until one day it wakes and finds that it still has every outward form of faith, but the heat that once animated those forms has dropped so far it can barely feel it. And the body housing that lukewarm, forgetful soul begins to speak in its own way. Saint Teresa of Jesus observed in her sisters and in herself that the soul living in sustained ingratitude develops a kind of interior heaviness that is not exactly sadness, not exactly illness, but which in time becomes both. It is that feeling that everything costs more than it should, that energy does not stretch as far as it once did, that the body is dragging something that is not purely physical, but which expresses itself physically with a constancy that is exhausting. Saint Teresa of Jesus describes this with a very concrete image in the way of perfection. She says the ungrateful soul is like a garden no one waters. For a time, the plants survive on the moisture stored in the ground from the last watering, but that moisture runs out, and when it does, the plants do not die all at once. They give way gradually, losing their color, losing their firmness, until one day someone looks at the garden and sees that it has not looked as it should for a long time, though no one can remember exactly when it began to change. The practice Saint Teresa of Jesus proposes for healing this root is what she called making memory, not a devotional exercise to be added to a list of prayers. A concrete interior practice, one that involves pausing regularly in prayer to move back through one's own life, searching for the moments when God's hand was present, looking for the graces received that have faded into the background without ceasing to be graces, calling to mind the times things could have gone so much worse and did not, the people who arrived at exactly the moment they were needed, the dangers that never materialized. Saint Teresa of Avila said that anyone who makes that journey with honesty discovers that their life is far richer than their ordinary memory had allowed them to see, and that this discovery opens within the castle a space of wonder and gratitude that is precisely the condition in which God's grace can begin to move again, with the freedom it had before forgetfulness started closing the corridors one by one. The body that houses a grateful soul breathes differently. Saint Teresa of Jesus did not say it in those terms, but she was describing it on every page, where she spoke of the effects of grace on the interior of the soul. When gratitude opens the door of the castle, when the soul begins once more to perceive its life as a gift, rather than as an entitlement, something in the relationship between soul and body reorders itself in a way that has consequences reaching beyond anything analysis can measure. But there is still one piece missing, the most important one, the one Saint Teresa of Jesus saved for last, because it is the one that changes everything else. Up to this point, Saint Teresa of Jesus has described the roots. She has described resentment living embedded in the soul, spoken by the body through tension and sustained inflammation. She has described fear that is never surrendered to God, spoken by the body through a deep exhaustion that no physical rest can fully remedy. She has described the withdrawal from prayer and the way the body housing a soul that has left the castle begins to lose the shelter that castle provided. She has described embedded grief that hardens into identity and stops the soul's movement towards the center where God awaits it. She has described ingratitude and the forgetting of graces received, and that gradual lukewarmness that slowly extinguishes the temperature of faith without anyone noticing exactly when the cooling began. 5 roots. 5 ways a wounded soul speaks through the body it inhabits. 5 diagnoses made by Saint Teresa of Jesus, with the precision of someone who knows the interior of the human castle better than any other cartographer in the history of Christian mysticism. But a diagnosis without a remedy is a cruelty, and Saint Teresa of Jesus was never cruel. What she taught about prayer, directed at each of these roots, is something her contemporaries had not articulated with that precision. Not because they did not pray, they did. Not because they did not believe in the power of prayer, they did. But because most people, in Saint Teresa of Avila's time and in ours, pray in general. They pray with a broad, diffuse intention that covers everything without touching any one thing, with the depth required to move what needs to be moved. They pray asking God to help, to heal, to protect, without first doing the work of descending into the interior of the castle to identify exactly what it is that needs healing and from which root the illness the body is expressing is actually growing. Saint Teresa of Jesus taught another way. She called it the prayer of recollection. And its first instruction is not a formula of words. It is an interior movement. It is the movement of going in, of closing, at least for a time, the windows of the soul that face outward, the ones looking toward the noise of the world, the worries of the day, the tasks waiting to be done, the fears demanding attention, and turning back inward, toward the castle, toward that center where God is present with a constancy that does not depend on the soul feeling it, or the prayer going well, or the heart being in the right condition to pray with the devotion one would wish to have. For the root of resentment, Saint Teresa of Jesus taught a prayer that begins not with forgiveness but with honesty, with naming before God, without euphemism and without rushing toward the edifying part, exactly what is there. The name of the one who caused the hurt, a description of the harm that was done, the anger, if it is still there, or the grief, or that combination of both that is far more common than either one alone. And then, only after all of that has been named honestly before God, the petition. Not the petition to be able to forgive yet, if that still seems impossible. The smaller, more honest petition the soul can actually make in that moment. The petition to want to forgive. Saint Teresa of Avila said that God works with what the soul has, not with what the soul wishes it had. And that minimal petition, if it is honest, is enough to set something in motion within the castle. For the root of fear that is never surrendered, the prayer that Saint Teresa of Jesus practiced and taught was the prayer of the open hand. Not a specific formula of words, but an interior gesture. The gesture of taking whatever the soul has been holding with both hands tightly clenched, whatever it is afraid to release because it fears that letting go means losing it forever, and opening those hands to God in prayer, placing it in God's hands with the declaration that God's hands are larger, stronger, and more trustworthy than one's own. Saint Teresa of Jesus was fully aware that this gesture requires practice, that it is not done once and done, that a soul that has spent a long time holding its fears alone needs to return to that gesture repeatedly, sometimes many times within the same day, until opening the hands becomes more natural than the gripping. For the root of withdrawal from prayer, Saint Teresa of Avila didn't propose an ambitious recovery program that a weakened willpower could not sustain. She proposed the minimum step, 5 minutes, one single point of contact each day with the interior of the castle, without requiring depth or feeling or results, only presence. Only entering and staying as long as possible with the disposition of one who returns after a long absence and knows that the relationship needs time to recover the temperature it once had, and gives it that time with patience and without drama. For embedded grief, the prayer Saint Teresa of Jesus taught began by lifting the departed, by naming them before God, not with the anguish of someone missing them, but with the confidence of someone entrusting them, by saying to God, "What I loved so deeply is in your hands, and I trust your hands more than I trust my own capacity to keep holding them inside me by the strength of this pain." And for the root of ingratitude, the prayer Saint Teresa of Avila called making memory, moving back through one's own life in prayer, searching for the traces of God, pausing at each one, naming them, giving thanks for them one by one, with the unhurried attention of someone who understands that every single one of those traces deserved more attention than ordinary daily life ever gave it. 5 roots, 5 directed prayers, 5 ways to descend to the exact place where the wound is and touch it with the light that Saint Teresa of Jesus learned to kindle in the interior of her own castle. But there is still more. Something Saint Teresa of Jesus saved for the very end of her teaching on this subject, because it is the hardest to grasp and the most transforming to receive. Something that no one who has stayed with us this far can afford to miss. There is a teaching of Saint Teresa of Jesus that her own spiritual directors were slow to understand, that her contemporaries, even the most learned and most devout among them, received with a resistance she understood because she had felt it herself before experience obliged her to surrender to the evidence of something she could no longer deny. It is a teaching that runs against the most natural instinct of any human being in the face of suffering. It runs against what any devout and well-meaning person would do instinctively upon seeing someone in pain. It runs even against what most people do when they pray for their own illness or for the illness of someone they love. And yet Saint Teresa of Jesus considered it the single most important key to everything she had discovered about the relationship between the soul and illness. The key without which everything else, the 5 roots, the 5 prayers, all the interior work of recollection and honesty and surrender, remained incomplete. The teaching is this: the most powerful prayer in the face of illness is not the one that asks for healing. It is the one that surrenders the illness. Sit with that for a moment, because it sounds like a play on words, and it is not. It sounds as though the same thing is being said in 2 different ways, and it is not the same thing. There is a difference that Saint Teresa of Jesus identified with surgical precision between asking God to take the illness away and surrendering the illness to God. And that difference changes everything, not only at the spiritual level, also in terms of what happens within the body, housing the soul that prays in one way or the other. Asking God to take the illness away is a prayer that arises from a position of resistance to what is happening, a position that is understandable, that is human, that no one can judge, because suffering deserves resistance, and the Catholic faith is not a faith that accepts evil as though it were good. But it is a position in which the soul remains the one directing the situation, the one deciding how things should go, the one presenting God with a plan that he ought to execute. And in that position, even if the prayer is sincere and the faith genuine, the soul remains at the center of its own universe of suffering, regarding the illness as the problem to be solved so that life can return to what it was before. Surrendering the illness is something radically different. It is the interior movement by which the soul ceases to be the center and places God in the center that belongs to Him. It is saying to God, not only heal me, but use me. Not only take this pain away, but do with this pain what only you know how to do. Not only restore the health I had, but take me where you need to take me, even if the path leads through here. Saint Teresa of Jesus arrived at this understanding through years of illness, during which the prayer of petition for healing did not produce the results she had hoped for, and in which, little by little, with the honesty that defined her, she came to realize that something in her way of praying was still more centered on herself than she had recognized. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in the book of her life that there came a point in her relationship with illness when she stopped asking God to take it away and began asking God to show her what to do with it. That this transition was not instantaneous, not easy, not the result of some heroic act of will. It was the result of having exhausted every other possibility and discovered that none of them produced the peace the soul needed more urgently than the health the body was asking for. And that, in the moment that transition took place, something in the interior of the castle reorganized itself in a way that also affected the body. Not necessarily with the healing she had asked for, with something deeper than healing. With that peace, Saint Teresa of Jesus describes as superior to physical health, because it sustains the soul even when the body is still suffering, and makes it possible to inhabit suffering from an interior position that is not passive resignation, but active participation in something larger than the pain itself. This is why Saint Teresa of Avila never separated the healing of the body from the transformation of the soul. Not because she believed the body did not matter, on the contrary. Precisely because the body matters, precisely because physical suffering is real and deserves all the seriousness and love with which she always treated it, Saint Teresa of Jesus could not settle for a solution that touched the body without touching the soul inhabiting it. She knew that solution was partial. She knew that a body healed without a transformed soul is a body that sooner or later falls ill again from the same root, because the root was never addressed. And what Saint Teresa of Jesus proposes as an alternative is the most demanding and the most liberating thing imaginable at one and the same time. Demanding because it requires releasing what is hardest to release, control over one's own body, one's own health, one's own future. Liberating because in the moment that release truly happens, in the moment the soul surrenders the illness with the trust of someone placing something precious in hands she knows are capable of holding it, something in the interior of the castle opens with an amplitude the soul had never experienced while it was gripping so tightly what it has now let go. That is what Saint Teresa of Jesus found at the very bottom of it all. That the prayer which heals is not necessarily the one that asks for the body to be cured. It is the one that transforms the soul from the root. And a soul transformed from the root lives in a body that has a far better environment for healing. Because the body housing a soul at peace is not the same body that was housing a soul at war with itself and with God, and with the suffering it did not know how to hold. They are the same body, but it is no longer the same castle. And that difference, according to the teaching of Saint Teresa of Jesus, changes everything. You have stayed with this all the way to the end because something in you knew you needed to hear it. That interior movement that Saint Teresa of Jesus described as the soul recognizing what belongs to it or when it finally finds it. And what you found today is not new information. It is an ancient truth that has been waiting for centuries for the exact moment when someone who needed it would be ready to receive it. Today, you discovered that there are illnesses born where no one thinks to look, that the body speaks what the soul keeps silent. That unresolved resentment, fear never surrendered to God, withdrawal from prayer, grief that embeds and hardens, and the ingratitude that cools the flame of faith. These are not merely spiritual concerns in some abstract sense. They are real roots of real suffering, deserving to be addressed with the same seriousness with which any wound is addressed. And that Saint Teresa of Jesus, who knew every one of these roots through her own experience before she ever wrote about them, left us a clear and concrete path for descending to each one and touching it with the light of directed prayer. But the deepest teaching in everything you have received today is this: the prayer that heals is not the one that asks for the pain to disappear. It is the one that places the pain in hands that know how to do with it what we alone could never imagine. That act of surrender is the most complete act of faith a soul can make. And Saint Teresa of Jesus knows this. She made it before you. And what she found on the other side of that gesture was something that no healing of the body could ever have given her on its own. There is more, much more, that Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote about the soul, about the body, about prayer, and about the paths God uses to lead a soul toward its center. That teaching is waiting for you in the next video appearing on your screen right now. Do not pass it by. What Saint Teresa of Jesus still has to say to you about what you carry inside is exactly what you need to hear next. God bless you. May Saint Teresa of Jesus intercede for you and for all those you love. And may every word you received today find in your heart the fertile ground it deserves, to grow in peace, in health, and in faith. Until next time.